Welcome to the Islamophobia Files. Assalamu alaikum. Islamophobia Files, where we examine how Islamophobia is constructed, weaponized, and resisted across institutions and everyday life. I'm your host, Dr. Hatem Bazian, and today we're focusing on the frontline fight against Islamophobia on the streets, in policy arena, and within our legal system. Our guest today is Corey Saylor, a dear friend and a colleague that I've worked with for quite some time. Corey is the Research and Advocacy Director at the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, which really is the nation's largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization, where we partnered with them on a number of reports and continue to work collectively. He's an expert on political communications, media relations, and anti-Muslim prejudice in the United States with over 2 decades experience. Corey is a nationally recognized leader in legal advocacy, in actually community advocacy and community protection, with years of experience documenting hate crimes, defending civil liberties, and building coalitions. So today we're really blessed and enriched by having Corey with us. So assalamu alaikum and welcome, Corey.
Alaikum salam. Thank you so much for giving me time, and thank you to everybody who watches this for giving us time out of your day.
Great. So let's start about Islamophobia and how it looks today. We just finished the Mayor Zohran Mamdani. Again, emphasis on pronouncing the name right, not intentionally mispronouncing it. So from your vantage point, considering that we had the Zohran Mamdani's election, and when you look at recent trends, what forms of Islamophobia are most pressing today? Hate crimes, discrimination, and how does it really look for Muslims on a national level?
Well, I think we're going to have to give some context here, and this is the Islamophobia file, so that's certainly permissible, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that in order to get to your answer, we start with in 2022, which was where CARE's data showed the first ever drop in incoming complaints to our organization. Something that we were so surprised by, I actually ended up calling all the people who submitted data for us and saying, like, is this right? Are you sure about this? Because we'd never seen that before in the almost 30 years that we've been doing the civil rights report. Then you get into 2023, and it looks pretty much exactly the same as 2022, slight increases until about October. In October, it all takes off. And in the last 3 months of 2023, we received 42% of the incoming calls that we received for the whole year. And I say that because it's very relevant to answering your question. We, over the last couple of years in the United States, have experienced one of the largest waves of Islamophobia that we have seen since CARE has been tracking the numbers. And it changed Islamophobia a bit, and it stayed the same. The stayed the same bit is we saw incoming complaints decreasing. Somebody flipped a switch back to on, and all the standard Islamophobic tropes were back, right? Muslims are more violent than others. Muslims mistreat women. Muslims are somehow going to take over the West from within, which, I mean, we know is hysterical. We're 1% of the population. Like, even if we wanted to, what are we going to do? But throughout 2023, 2024, you see that giant wave of Islamophobia under a Democratic administration. I think that's always a good thing for people to remember. This is both a Republican and a Democrat problem. So now we get to answering your question. 2025 arrives, and I haven't, we collect our data on a yearly basis. I think the story our data is going to tell is that the volume of cases that we were seeing in 2024, the biggest type that we saw in 2024 was employment discrimination, and it was because people were speaking out against genocide at work and being silenced. That's going to change. And what we saw early in 2025 was the government go back to being one of the primary drivers of Islamophobia. And we can talk about the administration and people within it. But what you saw were the early snatches, as it were, the Mahmoud Khalil, the Rumeysa Ozturk, the Badr Khansuri. These are very high profile. They've been speaking out, taking advantage of the free speech that the Constitution offers to everyone that is in the United States. But in their case, because they're immigrants, they are essentially kidnapped, right? It's hard to get abducted. It's hard to give it any other word. Now we get to Mamdani, and what we saw is this tremendous volume of hatred and Islamophobia driven toward him, large sums of money spent to defeat him, a Republican president endorsing a Democratic or independent candidate to do anything they could to defeat this person. And the Center for the Study of Online Hate released a report quite quickly after the election, and they found that about 78% of the social media conversation was things like terrorist leader and other sort of extremist threats. You also saw within that the standard Sharia is going to take over narrative. They said that was about 8% of the content that they reviewed. Threats to deport him. He's an American citizen, but there's apparently nowadays tiered American citizenship in which if you were a naturalized citizen, you no longer are equal to other American citizens in some people's minds. So I would argue that if 2023, 24, early 2025, a lot of the Islamophobia was driven to distract from genocide in Gaza and silence voices that were speaking out against that, we maybe saw a bit of a return to the more classical "I just hate Muslims." Though I'm pretty willing to assert that a lot of the forces driving that negative voice toward Mamdani were representing that same sort of let's just silence and smear the Muslims because we want to give cover to the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah. So you actually mentioned that in 2024, what you saw in terms of the data, it was predominantly employment related to people wanting to speak about the genocide, and then it's a shift now it's to the government. And you're pointing out that Democrats and Republicans. So what unites Democrats and Republicans in the push for Islamophobia? Because again, someone would say the Democrats are defenders of civil liberties, civil rights, they're liberal, but Islamophobia seems to actually bring them together on the same bridge. So what is it that drives this discourse?
It's different things for sure. And without a doubt, in my mind, the pro-genocide narrative is certainly one of the things that Democrats and Republicans have circled the wagons together about over the last couple of years. So, the Biden administration gave shocking levels of cover to the extermination of civilians that was going on in Gaza. You got to give a Republican some credit. Like, I'm still not sure yet if the ceasefire is going to hold, but there is one. Biden had negotiated one as well, but that fell apart pretty quickly. So without a doubt, the pro-Israel, pro-genocide narrative is one of those things. But then it gets a little more complicated. I will never forget back in 2014 when Eric Holder, then Attorney General for Obama, announced the revitalization of the countering violent extremism programs. And he did that exactly 1 month after ISIS had murdered 2 Americans in Syria and Iraq. And I say that because there is, and I think you stopped on this point, because there is that misconception that Democrats don't drive Islamophobia in the same way that Republicans do. I think Democrats are maybe a little nicer in their words. But certainly Eric Holder launched the Countering Violent Extremism program, and we spent years pushing back against that because its fundamental underlying assertion is that somehow Muslims need to be monitored more than any other population in the United States.
Mm. And I would say similar we find, let's say, in France and in European context, that some of the liberal, maybe left governments actually drive Islamophobia, sometimes more so than even what we might visibly see the right. So I think in here we're finding almost a consistent pattern that right and left, they might take a different, at least articulation, but at the core, it's both a left and a right political problems monetizing Islamophobia for political purposes. And I don't know if you can actually think how Islamophobia, at least we're talking about Mamdani, but also in relations to Democrat and Republican monetizing Islamophobia for electoral purposes as well.
Well, in New York, you had two viable candidates, right? I would argue that the Republican candidate maybe not as much. I don't think anybody predicted that he would be the winner. So you had two viable candidates who were both, for lack of a better word, Democrats, right? Cuomo lost initially and then came back and decided to run as an independent. But he's always been a Democrat. That switch in title.
And his father as well. So
yeah.
It's a democratic, like the establishment of the Democrats
it's the
or the
establishment.
royalty in New York.
And what you also didn't see is Democratic leadership in New York running to endorse the candidate that won their primary. So there's no doubt in my mind that certainly Democrats have not yet figured out how they want to relate to Muslims. I mentioned the CVE thing because they launched that program against us. But I also always used to describe it often felt to me during political campaigning season that Democrats wanted Muslim money, they wanted Muslim votes. And when it came time to take like the family picture, we were the ones who were pushed off to the side. That's weird, Uncle Harry, that we don't really want here. And the reason for that was and is because I think Democrats feel very weak on national security, and they feel like having us present exposes them to attacks through a national security framing, which is, as we know, ridiculous. We know that much of the terrorism in the United States is driven by white nationalists, but that's not the predominant narrative. And so I have found that Democrats often just seem to be afraid to allow our community to fully participate in American civic life, and will use the same tropes to attack us when it's convenient to them politically, as we just saw with Mamdani.
Now, I want to get your opinion on the ADL and Jonathan Greenblatt putting out the statement that they already are setting up a Mamdani monitoring desk or office to see and monitor his actions, which I think rightly CARE have put out a statement that this is Islamophobic and racist. So how do you situate what ADL, which at least defines itself as a civil rights organization, but in this case, it never misses an opportunity to actually utilize Islamophobia, going back to Ground Zero Mosque in terms of their statement, opposing almost every Muslim public figure that does not toe the line for Israel. So how do you actually see what the ADL is doing, continuing on the Mamdani's election?
The ADL under Jonathan Greenblatt's leadership it might even be time for them to consider registering under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, because they have in many ways become a mouthpiece to give cover to genocide, which to me is, anti-Semitism is a real problem, right? There's no question in my mind about that. And to see a group that could be doing a lot of good fighting that, and has in the past done a lot of good fighting that, decide to go full on, let's just defend Israel first. Let's just make sure that the genocide can move forward, and anybody who speaks out about it will get improperly labeled as an anti-Semite. It is just so incredibly disappointing to those of us who are committed to fighting all forms of hatred in the United States. And I think that if you look at some of the resignations that have occurred from that organization over the last few years, there are people within that institution that have that exact same feeling. Now, we can talk about the overarching problems the ADL has had going back to the 90s when they were spying on Arab Americans and ended up having, losing in court over those over that spying activity. But ultimately, the goal, I fight Islamophobia. That's my purpose. But what gets me into this every day is because hate just doesn't make sense to me. Why would you hate somebody based on their race, their ethnicity, their religion? So I'm on board with fighting all of these different types of hate. And I would argue to you that if you look at the dozens and dozens of statements CARE has issued fighting against hate of all different forms, including anti-Semitism, then you would see that this institution of CARE shares that view. And for the ADL to then decide, and particularly Jonathan Greenblatt, to decide that anyone who says, I think starving kids in Gaza just doesn't make any sense, to have that institution then label you as a hater because you're just looking at your social media feed going, that's horrifying. That's a giant problem and a giant loss of vision toward the mission that they should be achieving, which is reducing hate in this country.
Great. So I want to shift now to talking about data collection, how CARE and your project specifically collects data, because I think people are often have the understanding that if there's an Islamophobia case, it's a legal case. Or it immediately has to go to court. So maybe you could walk us through the process of documenting Islamophobia cases, what type of evidence connections are collected, and then how is the report that's annually put out, how does it come about?
Sure. And I'll start for the folks who are watching us in context, because you and I sort of know the report very well. Every year, CARE puts out a civil rights report. Its main theme is the status of Muslim civil rights in the United States. And this report was started after the Oklahoma City bombing, which was initially blamed on someone who looked Middle Eastern. And there was backlash against the Muslim community until they arrested Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, two white men who were the ones who had actually perpetrated the crime. So the report's been around for a while. And how CARE manages the data, we have chapters all across the country. When someone feels like they've been discriminated against, they fill out a form, or they call us, or they talk to us when we're at an event, and we will have either legal or paralegal staff intake that case. And California will intake cases for California, Washington State intakes cases for Washington State, and so on. What folks are listening for in those intakes is there evidence that corroborates or backs up what the person is asserting to us happened? So, documentation, video, other things that we can find, witnesses. And then they'll decide what to do with the case. And at that point, one of two things can happen. It all goes into the system. And I'll talk about later how I get those reports from everyone. But you reach a decision point. If there's a problem here and it doesn't need to be litigated, it is given to community advocacy staff. And community advocacy staff can pursue a number of different routes, right? Letter writing, press conferences, all the traditional advocacy methods that anyone in America is familiar with. Sometimes it has to go to litigation immediately, but not always. My team, or I help to oversee the folks who do the community advocacy work. We can often get very good results for people without having to litigate things. So, for instance, we have been dealing for a long period of time with a residential management company. A resident of the community projected onto her own building something of the order of Free Palestine. And there's a rule in the community that you can't project political messages, which was ignored for years and years and years and years until this person did it. And then all of a sudden, like, there's this rule, you can't break this rule. So we actually filed a civil rights complaint with the local city, and the local city did the investigating and determined that, yes, it does look very much like this person was singled out based on the type of political content they were putting out, as opposed to the actual rule. So you can get a lot done just through those kinds of channels. There are other times that we absolutely do have to litigate things, and we will often, we're a civil rights organization. One of our primary things is defending the Bill of Rights. So a lot of the civil rights cases we take on have to do with First Amendment free speech. So if you look at our pattern lately, we've filed many, many lawsuits targeting universities who have attempted to silence student groups or given punishment to student groups for simply participating in peaceable free speech. So there's the decision point on how we handle the cases. Now, the data, everybody records their data. You heard me say lawyers. That means that I can't see much of the information that the lawyers collect because that's protected by attorney-client privilege. So each chapter will prepare anonymized data for me based on particular points that we collect. What was the type of the incident that happened? Was it a hate crime? Was it a hate incident, right? Hate crime, somebody actually committed a crime. Hate incident, somebody came up and yelled something horrible at me. Terrible thing to happen, but that is free speech, and so it's not a crime. And then they all send that data to my office every January, and then we assemble the report and put that report out.
Now, from the work I do, as well as the networks across the world, it seems that one of the major challenges that Muslims organizations have is in terms of the number of cases that gets reported. So there's considerable underreporting. And even our colleagues at Othering and Belonging in their survey say Muslims believe that Islamophobia is a serious problem, but almost 90% don't report the cases that affects them or affect their community. So literally we're looking at least from the poll or the survey that they did, almost we're dealing with a 10% box. So the 90% is missing data. So what are the challenges and what keeps people away from actually reporting Islamophobia, even though they say it's a serious problem? This is, again, in the survey that we did, it says serious problem, but there isn't this report. So from your work and your national view for the Civil Rights Report, what are the challenges for the community in terms of reporting?
So I think the first one, and this really isn't a shock to anybody, is people often don't know where to report. So as you know, I know at CARE, we advertise our services constantly, but I can walk into any mosque, and if I've got 50 people there, I will ask who knows CARE. About half the room will raise their hand. If I say, how do you know where to report an incident of discrimination, like, that goes down. So really just making sure people know where to report. So mosques can put signs up that advertise these things. Schools can do the same. The other items that both Othering and Belonging and our own research have found, not everybody in the community feels comfortable reporting. So they may feel comfortable reporting to CARE, but there's a hate incident. So, excuse me, they've been, subjected to something that may have a criminal element. They're not really comfortable calling the police. And that has a lot of different things behind it. In part, it's the mass surveillance of American Muslims that has occurred over the last 30 years. In part, there are certainly many communities in the United States for whom interacting with the police has a very long history of being problematic, and the police aren't seen as protect and serve. They're seen as a force of oppression against many of these communities. So they don't want to report it to the police. The other thing that we add on top of othering and belonging is there's a desensitization in the community. And I often put it to people this way. I can go to a mosque, go to the leadership. Hey, what's been going on? Oh, yeah, this guy called us and threatened to blow the mosque up a couple of weeks ago. And I'll say, did you report that? And they'll be like, no, we get that all the time. We just hit delete. So there's been this sense that this is normal, and it's not. And I don't know, let me pause for 1 second. I've been in this, I'm a white guy, right? And my name, you will not single me out for my name. But because I'm a visible figure, I've been on my fair share of death threats and other things. But this normalization really hit home for me. In 2017, I took a break from care for a little while. So I had been in the Muslim movement for about 20 years at that point, and went to a different organization that helped Muslims, but the staff wasn't all necessarily Muslim. And they had one of those things, we all get together and let's introduce the new staffer, let's ask questions. And I was like, I don't want to do the standard boring, like, what's your favorite food? So I just, as a joke, said, what's your favorite death threat? And the whole room was horrified. And that was when I sat there and I went, wow, it's become normal to me. Like, to me, it's just like, this is the business, right? If you have an opinion in the United States, people are going to threaten to kill you. But that's not everybody's experience. Unfortunately, I think it's becoming more so with the last couple of elections. But yeah, we're desensitized. Muslims just sort of think this is the way things are.
Well, how also maybe we could add the following, and I would maybe ask you if you agree or not, that there is an internalized level of Islamophobia where we think that which is unacceptable is the norm. And therefore, we could actually say, oh, yes, because the public discourse, and this is what I say, that we are living in an Islamophobic social imaginary, and also Islamophobia is atmospheric. So the threshold becomes for us that normal, everyday Islamophobia is seen as the norm, and we internalize it as acceptable.
Our colleagues at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding just put out their American Muslim poll for 2025.
Yeah, I saw that.
And in 2022, using the Islamophobia index, which is a measure that doesn't capture every Islamophobic attitude, but it does. They are things that correlate with anti-Muslim policy. In 2022, Muslims had actually risen in their internal Islamophobia, and they scored it as a 26. And this year, it's in 2025, it's dropped to 19. But I remember reading the 2022 report and going, how is it that our own community hates ourselves? And, obviously ISPU can address that more in depth. Part of it, or if you look at what they're saying, part of it is that white Muslims who are born in the United States are more likely to hold Islamophobic attitudes than others. And they'll tell you they allow people of Arab background or, my background to identify as white. So I don't know that they can break it down any further than that for you. But I also think when I open up my X feed, when I open up my Facebook, when I watch the TV news, you're subjected to this steady diet of anytime a Muslim jaywalks wrong, they're going to get a ton of coverage. But if somebody who is of a similar background to me oftentimes does the same thing, same type of horrible thing, they don't get the same level of coverage. So if you're being subjected to this steady diet that makes you feel hostility toward your own faith, you're going to see those kind of numbers that we've been seeing. So yes, without a doubt, we live in an Islamophobic environment. And yes, without a doubt, that is causing people within our own community to adopt some of those attitudes.
Now, I know that you get this question, what is the use of what we're doing? Why is it effective to have this reporting? Discrimination just continues to increase. Surveillance policies and surveillance of the communities and harassment is there. And I know that this is the person who's, a skeptic, or which there we have a healthy number of those in the community. So usually this question is posed: what is the use? Is it useful? Is it possible to change and alter the directions of the society, considering that the elites, media, political leadership is vested in Islamophobic discourses?
There's a lot of ways to answer that question. I'll start with, in the United States, you are either at the table or you are on the menu. So is this worth it? I don't feel like being on the menu. I don't know about you. I would rather be at the table protecting other people. So I would argue to you that those of us who have been observing Islamophobia, like I got into this work in the late 1990s, we have seen certain changes. I don't think hate itself goes away. I think it can go in and out of fashion, and we'd like to make it unfashionable again. And I have evidence in front of me that that can be done. If you go back to the pre-Civil War in the United States, who was it that everybody was hating on? Catholics, right? And if you look at the cartoons about Catholics at that time, it's the same sort of garbage that's being done about Muslims now. John F. Kennedy is running for president, and people are saying the Pope could be running the country. Utter garbage, but it's recognized as that now. And it is rightfully cast to the side. Same thing with anti-Semitism, which is still a massive problem, but you see some of that same arc. Maybe not as moved out of front and center as I'd like to see it, but the same basic arc. So we as Muslims can look at the experience of other minorities in the United States and go, if you look at them when they started standing up and organizing and pushing back, that's when things changed. And the biggest example to me is, without a doubt, the African American community. And every day I get to use tools that the African American community has gifted to the rest of the United States through the horror of what they had to go through, first with slavery, then with Jim Crow, and whatever you want to call what continues on today. So what is the use of pushing back? If you're not out there pushing and creating your own narrative and making sure people understand that hating on you and your community is not going to be tolerated, then that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to create narratives about you, and they're going to hate upon you. So push back. I would also argue that as a Muslim, if you look at Sharia, what does it boil down to, right? Be a benefit to humanity.
Are you calling for the establishment of Sharia in the United States? Because I know somebody's going to say Sharia law right now.
Well, they'll clip this no matter what we say or do. But if you boil Sharia down, be a benefit to humanity, avert harm from humanity, not Muslims, humanity.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? It means, let me look after my neighbors. Let me make sure that my neighbors who don't have SNAP benefits because the government can't keep itself together have food. And I don't need to go out and call attention to myself. I just do it. Let me not invest in pornography and gambling. Let me make sure that elections are free and fair. So as people of faith, we are driven to look out for our neighbors. I am
Hmm.
all for having vigorous debates. You know, do you like Islam? Do you not like Islam? That's fine. That's not what I do, though. My job, influenced by my faith, is to look at the Bill of Rights and go, wow, we have some really cool things here. Let's protect that so that other people can have conversations about, do you want to be part of this faith? Do you not want to be part of this faith? Like, that's all fine. So yeah, I hear you. I know the scare tactics that are used all the time, but the reality is, when you look at Muslims, what is Zoran Mamdani running on? Looking out for other people. You can agree or disagree with his policies, but he was talking about looking out for other people. Muslims have served in Republican and Democratic administrations. When they're, in Texas, we had the floods earlier this year. Muslims were there providing relief. And all of that is driven by this notion: avert harm from humanity, protect humanity, right? So you can fearmonger all you want, but the reality often leaves people going like, well, that sounds like an ordinary religion to me.
Well, thank you. That was a great response and a great answer to the whole fear mongering and creating this tension in the public discourse around the word Sharia itself and Muslims being positioned to respond in almost the most negative knee-jerk reactions. Maybe we could migrate a little bit to a different set of questions and responses in terms of what is the role of the community and community organizing in strengthening the advocacy level? And what are the things that you would like to see from the community level? Earlier, we were talking about the resources and the alignment of resources. So, one is how critical is community organizing for advocacy? And then how to address some of the challenges needed to push our community organizing to impact advocacy at a higher level.
Look, one of the arcs that I've seen since I started in this work, and I get to do that now, right? I'm almost at 3 decades in this work, so I get to have the white beard and be like, you youngins don't know. But one of the things that to me is critical in the organizing of our community is most of the successful Muslim institutions these days, at least in the advocacy space, actually represent a base. So 30 years ago, there were a lot of organizations. They were national level. It was a couple of people, and they really, didn't have chapters or a community behind them. And that's really changed. And I think that's fantastic because that's healthy. I mean, throw in another Islamic term just to scare you. Shura, consultation, right? You're talking to lots of
Mhm.
people and you're formulating policy based on what they're telling you they need. But that's also where real power comes from in the United States. If you're talking to politicians, they are often calculating, how many votes can you deliver? Can you deliver money to my campaign? Are there VIPs that I can talk to who can get me in touch with a lot of voters? Do you have volunteers who can help with my campaign? So when the community is organized, it's not, hi, I'm Corey Saylor walking into this Texas representative's office, and they're going to look at me and go, dude, you're not from Texas. You don't matter to us. And they don't mean that in a mean way. It's just like, I don't vote for that particular member. When you have a strong and well-organized community, then the congressional offices are going to take representatives of that community far more seriously, but when I go along with groups from Texas to Texas representatives or Florida for Florida representatives, then they take me more seriously as well because I'm actually with constituents. So that organizing becomes incredibly important because that shows the actual strength of the community. And you don't need to have 1,000 voters, right? If you have a few well-placed individuals who own small businesses in the district and are known for donating, like you're going to get taken more seriously. The other thing that goes along with that, though, that's critically important is you're known. One of my greatest pet peeves is that, if we have this great thing that's telling us be a benefit to humanity, we can't just sit in the masjid and contemplate. You should spend time in the masjid, you should learn, you should contemplate, and then you should go out and put it into action, which means the community around your masjid knows who you are and what you stand for. Because you were absolutely right earlier. People will throw scary terms out, they will fearmonger. And what you often see is that when a community is not known, that fear mongering is going to be more effective than when people are like, oh, but I know Hatem, he's all right. I mean, what are you talking about? Right? He's there at the soup kitchen every week. You can't tell me he's something other than a great person. So community organizing, it helps us in our political outreach. It helps us in the community outreach and living through our faith. And the thing that goes along with that, and I know viewers are going to roll their eyes at this, I work for a nonprofit. We are always resource shy, right? More money coming into institutions like this so that we can do the work that people want us to is astoundingly critical. And I say that from the viewpoint of when I started in this work, like for a while, I worked for an organization that was just 2 people. And we had a lot we wanted to do. Couldn't do it all. Now I work for an organization that has hundreds of staff across the country. And what we're capable of achieving is by leaps and bounds more impactful. And if you look at what was done to Mamdani as he was running, I can't make a social media video and just put it onto a feed and hope that goes somewhere. You can pay for that advertising to be seen by people. And when you see these giant networks of people posting horrifying stuff on X, a lot of it is bots, and those bots are driven by people that are paying money for those things. So we oftentimes are just out-resourced. And as those resources have become more and more available, I would argue to you, your institutions have become more effective. And if you'll indulge me for one moment, let me just give you a very clear example. CARE, if you go back to 2008, 2009, had, I think it was like 1 attorney on staff in the national office and maybe 1 attorney at one of the chapters. And the institution decided to invest in more legal resources. At first, we were hiring people almost straight out of law school. Fast forward to now, we have dozens of attorneys across the country, and we have some of the foremost experts in the watch list on the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which is often used when you're defending mosques. And one of our attorneys argued in front of the Supreme Court about the watch list and won a 9-0 win. So going from, that took time to build, and it took patience and understanding from the community. But now the community is better protected. The Bill of Rights is better protected, and we are averting harm from other people, because if we're in court fighting the watch list that's used against us, that same watch list can't be deployed in the horrifying ways against other communities as it has been against us.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask the question about the shift into hiring more attorneys and legal staff, which I've been observing over the past 15 years. So you already answered, and I'm very aware of the California staff with Zahra Bilo, the Northern California. I'm also aware of Hussam Aloush team in LA, the San Diego team, Sacramento. So I'm aware of the changes within the ground organizing level for care. And you mentioned a number of success cases. Maybe I could also ask about how do you situate coalition building within community organizing for care and its impact on advocacy and impact on public policy?
There needs to be more of it. And this is one area where I may ding the Muslim community a little bit, but bear with me for a second. Let me give a
Mhm,
bit of a broader answer. We mentioned earlier, if you look at nobody knows how many Muslims there are in the United States, and that's because on the census you don't ask people for
mhm,
religion. So there's two sort of trains of thought. There's what Pew Research put out in 2017, which put the population of Muslims at about 1%. And then there's been some other work done by Dr. Ihsan Bagbi and Institute for Social Policy and Understanding that puts it a little bit higher. But either of those numbers, you're still talking about 1 to 2% of the population,
mhm,
which you either work in coalition or nothing will ever happen on your benefit. And even if you're not like that sort of Machiavellian about without the numbers, we can't do anything, which we're not because we're a faith community, there are many issues that other people in the United States share with us. And we should all be working together. And a perfect example of that is the Gaza genocide. When I go to rallies, I see Muslims, Arabs, Christians, Jews, uh, Asian Americans, African Americans. It is a very broad coalition. And I don't think anyone can argue that having that coalition present has helped change the narrative about what's going on in that region over the last few years, right? The elites may still not have noticed, but certainly if you look at polling, like the public has noticed that maybe what we've been being told over the last few decades isn't exactly accurate and that we need to learn some new things. So that's coalition work, right? Where I get to possibly dinging the Muslim community, and I say this in all respect, and,
mhm,
in like I'm part of this, is that to a degree, because we've been under siege for so long and in self-preservation mode, uh, we don't get out and work on other issues in the way we should. And some people have really stood out on this, like Linda Sarsour in New York. When she picked up stop and frisk, which was an issue of minority communities being stopped by police without really having done anything wrong and then checked, that really elevated her voice. And that, if you ask me, if we're talking about Islam, if we're talking about what motivates you to become an activist, that's it right there. She wasn't looking at just the Muslim community issues. She was looking at what do the people in my city need? And we just don't get there as often as we should as Muslims. You can say, we're small organizations and there's a lot on our shoulders. Uh, but I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we can expand our work there.
yeah.
And yeah,
Maybe I want to also add to the conversation the space of the interfaith work that has been often interfaith work that really toward normalizing with Israel rather than actually interfaith work for justice. So there are many across the country that engage in interfaith where it's really about normalizing relationship with Israel, Zionism, and so on, rather than actually engaging in interfaith work for justice to improve the society and the community. And I think Sana Saeed and others have written about faith washing. So what often appears to be coalition building, in essence, is actually weakening the Muslim community and creating internal divisions.
well, you notice when I talked about coalitions, I never mentioned interfaith.
Yeah, yes,
And
sure.
that's just honestly because many of the people I work with, I mean, within care, I've never asked them what their faith is because it's about issues. And on issues, there are many people that align with us on many of the things that we stand for. We have, and just to give you an example of how great people can be, because we forget sometimes. Uh, We have cases in Fairfax County, Virginia at this point where a school singled out some Muslim kids wearing Palestinian garb for participating in a video trend that students all across the country are doing, but somehow becomes threatening when it's Muslim students and not like everybody else. And we've had lawyers from outside of the Muslim community offer their services to us to help us with that. So it's about issues to me. But let's go to interfaith for a moment. I am an activist, so my answer is going to sound like an activist. I am 100% interested and curious in other people's religions and their beliefs, and we'll sit and talk to you about it all day long. But if it doesn't go any further than that, then I, as an activist, begin to become uncomfortable. So if I, for instance, I will always suggest to people, if you're sitting around with folks from the local churches and synagogues and temples, go do Habitat for Humanity or something like that, something that puts these conversations into the value space that we all live. And that, to me, is the essence of interfaith work, right? Putting it to values. Now, if I become so invested in those relationships that I'm afraid to have hard conversations when it needs to happen, then I think I've lost the point, to be honest with you. And I, to your critique, I have seen people who, in conversation with other faith groups, suddenly become afraid to go, what they're saying about Muslims in India? Like, that's a problem, man. Like, it's not the faith that's doing it, it's the government politicizing the faith. The things that people tell me about the state of Israel don't align with what I'm seeing in my social media feed. What I'm seeing in my social media feed is horrifying. If you can't have those conversations with people, then I think that might be the time to walk away from those conversations. Let me finish on this, Hatem. Politics is a really difficult business, right? No doubt about it. And to be successful, you're going to end up having relationships with people you don't necessarily agree with. And
Sure.
when I'm teaching folks about advocacy, what I always say is look for people who care about solutions to problems. If they're looking for solutions to problems, then it's worth continuing the conversation. If they're just sort of waiting to make their talking points or think you should just agree with them, don't bother with that. Right? You're wasting your time.
Right. Now, we started the conversation about Zohran Mamdani and the attacks on him. And maybe we could just circle back and speak about the Palestine issue and how pro-Palestinian protest advocacy is so much driving Islamophobia, and not only in here, but in the UK, in France, and so on. And how does CARE, in terms of working around this issue, has been at least in the forefront? I'm like following constantly the work of CARE on that. So how much anti-Palestinian racism is driving one major component of Islamophobia, which you touched on it earlier, but just as a way of getting back to that earlier conversation.
As we get into that conversation, it's really worth mentioning that foreign governments are interested in driving Islamophobia in the United States. And you can go back to the 2016 election. The Russian government was seeking to drive division using Linda Sarsour as the vehicle for that, because it was in their interest to have Americans fighting each other. Now, we know from reporting that Israel's foreign ministry has expanded its outreach budget by 150 million in 2025. And other reporting shows us that they've paid PR firms in the United States to do research for them. One of those is Stagwell Global, who in Stagwell Global's report, or at least part of one that was leaked to the media, their research found that fomenting fear of Islam and Muslims is one of the things that helps improve Israel's standing in the United States. And so they're investing in that. And they're also investing in other things that I've just found, as a civil rights person, deeply problematic. There was further reporting about how they were geofencing churches in 4 states out west, or in the West where you're at. So that when you go to church on Sunday, your phone number can be harvested and you will receive more pro-Israel advertising. And all this is documented. People are free to check it. So that's driving from the outside Islamophobia. We've talked about Hindutva groups and the groups that support Narendra Modi. That's driving Islamophobia from the outside. But here domestically, like we started talking a little bit about the ADL and some of the other groups. Let's talk about a couple of things that have happened. The ADL initially started identifying pro-Palestinian protests. Nothing anti-Semitic would get said, but that would be labeled as anti-Semitic. We've seen efforts to silence people through the passage of, and I can never remember the full word, sorry for the political jargon, maybe you remember the full word, but the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, whose author has testified in front of Congress and said we shouldn't use this as policy because it was just a thinking tool. And yet in many places we see Israel First groups pushing this policy on schools and states, because what it can do is, if I speak up and I say, what we were talking about earlier, I think starving kids to death in Gaza is wrong, that could get me labeled as anti-Semitic, and in some places actually subjected to consequences. So these internal groups seem to have found that they're losing the argument, and polling, I think, backs me up on that. So they're going to deploy tools to silence us rather than allow that very necessary public conversation to continue.
Yeah. And maybe as an addition to this, and I don't know where the data or the research from CARE comes, the propensity of social media to censor Muslim voices, accounts, whether Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We just saw there's a whole avalanche of that type of censorship. So how is CARE attempting or dealing with this, considering that TikTok, the sale of TikTok had nothing to do with China. It had to do more with trying to limit the impact on the critique of Israel and the genocide. So how does this migrate into advocacy on the social media space, which also is a ground zero for the intensive use of Islamophobic content, yet does not get to be removed or dealt with as hate speech on the social media space?
So we and many of our allies have for a long time been engaged in speaking to Meta, maybe not so much X anymore since it's been under new ownership. In the past, TikTok, I haven't been in touch with them for a while, about and making sure that their policies and rules platform people who have different viewpoints. Now, certainly, we all understand that hate is a problem. In the United States, we have we try to keep, we prefer speech over banning speech, because the problem often comes up that the people banning speech are banning speech they don't like, as opposed to, the real hate that we'd all like to see go away. And we continue to work with them. But that goes back to what we were discussing earlier, Hatem. You're talking giant corporations. Meta makes in, I don't know, I'm got 30 seconds what I make in years, right? And how do I deal with that, because a corporation ultimately is going to be interested in its bottom line. And they can say differently, but we all sat during, after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, the African-American man who cop knelt on him and essentially suffocated him. You had a number of corporations essentially come out and promise their staff, particularly their African-American staff, that they were going to do better. And all of that was flushed out the window starting at about October 2023, if it was ever serious. So you've seen corporations that were starting to, because staff was saying, we want our corporation to be more ethical, and corporations that were starting to move that way. I would argue after October 2023, when the latest round of violence between Israelis and Palestinians got started, and then, and we quickly launched into the genocide, these corporations backtracked on that very quickly. And that continues. So we get reports about all of these different platforms taking certain keywords and pushing them down. But the ultimate goal always has to be, in organizing, am I communicating with my immediate base so that we can organize and, show up at the political rallies where we need to, and engage with the politicians who we need to be talking to. So as long as that flows, TikTok can say whatever it wants, right? But then I want to engage with larger audiences, and that's where that becomes, that kind of suppression that you're talking about becomes more of a problem. And I'll end on this. Our political opposition recognizes that. That's why you see some of these, particularly like with the purchase of TikTok, that's why you see a group of people that are fairly heavily stacked with pro-genocide voices, Israel First voices, because they know that while TikTok was a platform where Palestinian voices got fair treatment, and that sort of conversation doesn't help the pro-genocide voices, so they're going to shut it down by buying it.
Yeah. Well, I said you could buy TikTok, but you cannot cover the truth, meaning that the genocide on a global level is irreversible. For the evidence, you cannot unsee what was seen and witnessed, and you cannot undo the extensive live streamed genocide that is there. But that's a separate discussion and a question.
But you can invisibilize it, right?
You can, but I think in the US, maybe there is, because TikTok purchase is specifically for the US market, while on the global level is different. And I do think that the tipping point has already been reached in relation to the genocide, in relation to Palestine. And I don't think it is a reversible process that money, resources, silencing will not be able to do that. But that's a separate discussion altogether for us to have on that particular question.
For sure. I'll just add this before you get to your next question, though. I have a lot of family in Scotland. That's where my mother is from. I did a lot of growing up there. And in conversations with my cousins, to my invisibilizing, they're not, politically engaged folks, but many of the things that I think are common knowledge. So even, that's a very small sample.
Sure.
But it goes to my point, I think, of these platforms like Meta, because them downplaying certain keywords doesn't just happen in the United States.
Sure, absolutely. So maybe as we get into the final moments, what advice do you give to Muslim organizers, to young lawyers, to young advocates who are stepping into the work that CARE and other groups are doing in the civil rights advocacy? So what's advice, the 1, 2, 3 things that you possibly would offer them at this point?
I'll start with what they offer the rest of us. And I've made this point in many places. What I saw happening on college campuses throughout the genocide brings me tremendous hope, because you had very smart organizing, organizing that understood you don't just go into the quad and have a protest. You have to have something you want. You have to understand who the people who can give that to you are, and you have to figure out how to make sure they're hearing the message that you're trying to deliver. That's just been amazing. And I think that as this generation of activists graduates, I'm excited about hiring them and maybe going and spending some time on a beach somewhere while they sort of drive all the work forward, because amazing things. So, first and foremost, I think I always advise people that when you get into this work, you need to be an optimist. You need to believe that change is possible. And we talked earlier, I gave you a number of different, I think, pieces of evidence
Mhm.
that show that change is possible. But you need to believe that, and then you need to take it and just drive it really far down and surround it in pragmatism, because change is also really slow. And this business can be very frustrating, because things that you think are simple and logical, let's not starve children, it causes this whole friction of you getting toward that goal.
Mm.
So number one, come into the business as an optimist, protect that optimism no matter what, wrap it in pragmatism. But number two, this work is so worth doing. And I say that we end up dealing with people who have gone through really horrible things in their lives, like all the time. And that puts a weight on you. But every so often you can help them out and you can get justice for them. And when you get those moments, when you see, I will never forget at one point in time, I had spent hours and hours and hours going by hand. So before all this stuff was nicely digitized, people's Form 990 filings, tax forms, most boring thing you can ever read in your life. But I spent hours, and I found that one of the leaders of an Islamophobic organization had given herself a really big raise. And when I put that information out in public, like her own base, her own chapters turned on her. So when when you sit in this work and you do it well and you do it right, and you get that person who is like, thank you, that, what do we say, 10% who actually report it to you, and then you get to work on it, that's just amazing. Because it does restore your belief that things can be all right and things can go well.
Yes.
And then the other thing that I just advise people, like, start now. Like, if you're in high school, get involved in something now. One of the things that is just never ceases to amaze me. I started this work in the mid 1990s. I had studied at school to become a substance abuse counselor because that was where my interest was. And through my work with the Muslim Students Association, the person leading our campus saw what he thought were some sparks of good advocacy. Like, you can ask other people about that. But and he introduced me to a Muslim organization who hired me. I had no background in this, right?
Mm.
I was made a communications director. I didn't even know what a press release was, right? I had to call somebody and ask them. But nowadays, like my colleague that I was working with for the last couple of years, she went to Harvard and Cambridge, got her master's from Cambridge, and studied Islamophobia the whole time. I'm now working with somebody who went to Harvard Kennedy to study
Mm.
policy. That's amazing.
Mhm.
So my advice nowadays is go out and do this, right? Help political campaigns,
Mm.
learn all that stuff, because what you're studying in school has use, and then what you will learn out in the field has use. And that way, when you show up at the front door of an organization like CARE, you're able to contribute in ways that people like me, like there was no way I could have contributed like that when I first started. So study this stuff early, learn, because there are many, like, they're not going to teach you in school many of the tricks that we all know. You learn that out in the field. So study it, volunteer with it, bring it to the organizations, and you'll get to sleep really well at night because there are wins, and they're so worth it. It's so worth being able to go home at night and tell your family about this good that I did in the world today, even if it was one person.
Right. Now, people want to have more information from CARE. Is there a website, contact that they could reach? We could put it also on the YouTube video. Do
I
you want to share
appreciate
that
that.
information?
So CARE is CAIR.com. You can go to that website and subscribe to our mailing list. You want to become involved in advocacy and you don't have but 5 minutes, find an organization like CARE, sign up to their mailing list. We'll ask you to do something every once in a while. It's very easy. So CARE.com. The other site that I always like to point people to is Islamophobia.org. That's the website that my team runs. We keep different profiles of different anti-Muslim groups and individuals in the country. And we also give a lot of tips on how to push back against Islamophobia.
Great. I would actually say that I have seen CARE from day one, way back. The first chapter here opened in the San Jose Bay Area, and I am a person that benefited from CARE. I have my few cases and few of my Islamophobic complaints that went through CARE. So I do encourage people to access CARE's website. And if you are able to support and donate to this critical work, by all means, it takes all of us to make a difference for all of us. So CARE is an organization that's from the community, belongs to the community, and it's very important to support their work on civil rights and Islamophobia. So Corey, thank you for grounding us in both the realities and the human stakes of this work. Islamophobia has an impact on our daily life. Thank you for being with us, taking precious time in the middle of the day to share your views. What we are reminded of today is that Islamophobia is not accidental, is structured, funded, and sustained by systems of power and ignorance. But it also can be resisted through documentation, through data, through collective organizing, through communities that refuse to be silent. CARE has been in the forefront of refusing to be silent and developing those capacities within the community to resist Islamophobia. To our listeners, Islamophobia is not just a narrative problem or a media problem, it's a policy problem, and a policy requires pressures, requires data. Data changes policy, maybe not in the short term, but in the long term. If you don't have data, then it did not happen. So I encourage you to engage in forwarding your cases and reporting these cases. If you experience discrimination or need support, reach out to local advocacy organization like CARE. They have national offices in different states. In California, we have 4 different offices. Connect with the community, document everything, and don't face these challenges alone. Thank you for listening to the Islamophobia Files, where we continue exposing the architecture of bigotry and elevating those who are dismantling it. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and stay committed to justice. Assalamu alaikum.